Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Using New Forms of Analytics. I'm your host, Allison Crawford. There is no debate that the amount of data collected by companies is increasing. By tracking transactions, customer data, supplier costs, and other business metrics, companies can understand what's really happening inside the organization. But how do you ensure you're tracking the right data and in the right way to create a winning strategy? In this webinar, we'll talk with Kyle Ham of Schneider Electric as he shares his thoughts around their analytics journey and their understanding of big data. But before I hand this over to Laura and Kyle, there are a few things that I want to cover with you. First, we're recording today's session and we'll post it to our on-demand webinar page. You can visit our page to view this website or the webinar to listen to this or any of our other webinars. Additionally, we'll send out the slides to all attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, reach out to Laura or myself to set up a private discussion. Finally, we want to hear your questions about our findings. Please post to the chat or Q&A function to the left of your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to address all of your questions. We'll also be live tweeting the webinar, so if you'd like to join in the social media conversation, you can use the hashtag SCIWebinar and the handle @SCIInsightsLLC during the event. With that, let me introduce your two speakers. Kyle has over 20 years of experience in engineering and supply chain, having held roles in R&D engineering and product development in a large plastics company, as well as continuous improvement director, plant manager, regional operations VP, and VP of supply chain deployment and industrial strategy for Schneider Electric. He is currently serving as the Chief of Staff to the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Schneider Electric and leading technical projects in the area of supply chain digitization and data analytics. Kyle has a BS in mechanical engineering and an MBA and is a licensed professional engineer and considers himself a lifetime learner. Kyle is joined by Laura Cesari, founder of Supply Chain Insights. As an enterprise strategist, Laura focuses on the changing face of enterprise technologies. Her research is designed for the early adopter seeking first mover advantage. She comes to the stage with over 40 years of diverse supply chain experience. Laura, I know this is a topic that's generating quite a bit of interest in the industry, and I'm sure that there's a lot to say between you and Kyle today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to you to get started. Laura?
Well, thank you so much, Allison, and I want to thank Kyle for joining us. Again, our format for these webinars that we do monthly that are complimentary is to ask a supply chain professional to help us with sharing the research with the larger audience. We like to use our research as really the backdrop to have a good discussion, and I think Kyle and I will have a great discussion today. So Kyle, tell us a little bit about yourself, the stuff that maybe is not on the bio, and a little bit about Schneider Electric, just to set the stage.
Sure, Laura. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to spend some time with you for the next hour or so and chat a little bit about what I think is a very interesting topic and having a huge impact, I think, in the supply chain world today and even much more in the years to come. So, I have kind of an unusual title, Chief of Staff. I don't think probably a lot of organizations in the supply chain world maybe have this role. It's an opportunity for me to work within Schneider to kind of work on some of these types of technical projects, bringing together what does this big data really mean to us? What does some of this analytics and what's digitization mean for Schneider Electric, in particular on the supply chain side? So, I've had a lot of good experiences. It's a relatively new role for me, as you know. I don't know if you'll bring that story up, but I reached out to you not too long ago, really, last year, and we began kind of having some discussions in this area. So Schneider Electric is, for those of you that don't know, a large international organization. We really call ourselves polar in that we cover the entire globe. Roughly $30 billion in sales, 180,000 employees. We have manufacturing plants in over 40 countries, 230 locations, more than 100 distribution centers. We go to market in about every channel, really omni-channel. We have make-to-stock products, make-to-order products, configurable products. We do engineered products for large projects. We really focus on 5 supply chain models, trying to fine-tune the experience of our customers in the way we establish and kind of refining our supply chain to meet those expectations of those customers in those 5 different areas as well. So that's a little bit about myself and Schneider.
So Kyle, when we first started the engagement, what drove you to ask the question about big data analytics, a new form of analytics? How did this kind of percolate to the surface at Schneider?
Well, Laura, we at Schneider, I think it's fair to say, being such a large organization, have a lot of pockets of what I would call kind of big data analytics, business intelligence, projects going in many different places in many different areas. And as I began to kind of transition to my new role, I felt like I really needed to kind of get an external perspective on some of these things. And clearly, there's not an article. It seems like at least 1 out of 3 of any supply chain articles being published today is dealing with these types of topics. So I was kind of reaching out, looking at different sources, and you were one of the blogs that we were taking a look at and following, and it was a great opportunity to kind of partner with you to get your insights and quite candidly kind of tutor and mentor me, I guess, and be a sounding board for me to bounce ideas off of. And so I very much appreciate the time you spent with myself and with Schneider. So.
Well, it's been a great experience, and one of the great things, Kyle, is that you have the courage to ask questions that you may not know the answers. And I think so many people, because it's a new language, it's a new way of thinking, aren't willing to say, well, what does that mean? So I'm hoping that everyone will fill out the questions so that we can have that dialogue. So, Kyle, I'm going to just share some slides, and then I'll pause and let you give some reflections to the audience. So when we look at business pain of respondents, and we now have been in the research business for the last 4 years, and we've built a database of 6,000 respondents, and we ask, what are the top business pain elements for you doing your job? You can see the demand and supply volatility is top of the list, and that cross-functional alignment is next, supply chain visibility is there third, and access to use data and availability of skilled people to do the job. And I think analytics runs through all of those top business pain issues. Demand latency has increased 10 to 15 times what it was a decade ago because of the long tail and the complexity of the item master and the complexity of customer requirements. Cross-functional alignment between operational teams and commercial teams and new product launch. As we've become more global, we need to have data that moves more quickly between these teams. We tend to have more master data issues. Supply chain visibility, unfortunately we can't get to the data for first and second tier suppliers very easily, and then the ability to use data in people's jobs. So when we looked at the data around which supply chains are doing the best job, and this was a questionnaire that we had in many of our surveys where we asked people to describe their supply chains. And you can see that even though people will loosely use the term best practices, about a third of companies say there's a great need for improvement. And I find often that these companies are working on concepts that I'm going to just characterize as next generation supply chain processes. And I also find that companies would like to be faster to get to data, more aligned. And when we pulled out the difference between the companies that said that there was room for improvement versus those that think that their supply chain was working well, there were two main differences that were significant at a 90% confidence level. One was the ability to get to data, and the second was supply chain visibility. Both of them, I think, are great areas for improvement using some of the new analytics techniques. But before we talk about the new analytics techniques, I want to just take a minute and set the stage for big data analytics. So most supply chain leaders are used to talking in the language of 3-letter acronyms. My ERP to your ERP, and if we can have the master data issues fixed between PLM and CRM, and if we can improve forecast accuracy and APS to be able to work to SCM, along that you hear all these 3-letter acronyms. And we're really in this paradigm that analytics are going to grow up around the 3-letter acronyms. And as we deal with big data analytics, I believe that that's a false assumption. The average company has 150 different applications, and in fact, 5 ERP systems, and I'll let Kyle talk about the complexity within his global organization. but most organizations are dealing with a lot of IT complexity. And the idea we would have one ERP or even our common instances would be similar has proven to be false. Even if people have the same vendor like Oracle or SAP for an ERP source, the instances have very different sorts of data. And we've also invested in workforce productivity tools. And they may be social collaboration tools or our Microsoft stack. But in between this is a need for analytics. And the analytics need to really be focused on the cloud and the use of cloud-based analytics for descriptive analytics that really allows us to visualize data, streaming data, which allows us to take sensor data and telematics data to be able to drive real-time decisions. And one of the interesting things at a recent conference that we talked about is right-time data, not necessarily real-time data, because not every data source needs to fly first class, but right-time data. And then data pools or data lakes and the mining of data. And so as we deal in this analytics layer, each of those types of data, whether they're streams or clouds or data lakes, have a different architecture and a different need to connect them together between our three-letter acronym SOUP and the workforce productivity tool. So Kyle, let's just get your perspective. As we think about Schneider, how does this fit your situation? What's the IT landscape at Schneider, and what do you see as the analytics layer?
Well, let me maybe start with if there's people on the call who maybe are newer to this or still kind of growing their expertise, and I guess my first comment would be is not to be intimidated, right? So I think in the supply chain world, we're pretty used to those three-letter acronyms that you showed and talked about, and maybe comfortable with that. But I think as we look forward into the analytics tools and the discussions we have further on the next hour, not to be intimidated, that there's a lot of topics here that I think you can relate back to and begin to understand the transformation and the evolution. If you think about those key business pains that you showed a moment ago and talked about cross-functional alignment, supply chain visibility, demand and supply volatility, I think all supply chain professionals are struggling with these same types of issues. I've kind of thought about how we approached at Schneider attacking these types of issues. Where are we today and where are we headed, and some of the challenges that we have. First off, something we really haven't discussed, Laura, is I think there's an organizational kind of structure to being successful at this as well. And at Schneider Electric, we put in place a chief supply chain officer that really kind of has full aspect accountability for all the different pieces. And I think structurally, that has helped us move a little faster here of late. That chief supply chain officer reporting directly to the CEO, in effect, had more than half of the people of the organization reporting to her. So very large piece. Structurally, it allowed us to move a little faster. We have kind of a bimodal approach in that we have embedded supply chain people in each of the business units as well, who can kind of speak the language of the supply chain and help describe the needs from the business perspective to the supply chain organization and vice versa. But then you start to think about the visibility challenges. Getting data is clearly an issue, and being quite candid, it's a huge issue within Schneider. So, you kind of set me up there because the number of ERPs and the number of struggles we have within Schneider around data cleansing and data availability. Just to put it in perspective, Schneider has more than doubled the size of its organization over the last 10 years, and that's largely been through acquisition. And as you go through a lot of acquisitions, you'll find that you get a collection of ERPs, some very old, some very new. And even when you have a consistent ERP like SAP, we find that we have many instances of that same ERP system across the globe. So we do have a lot of challenges in that world. Ultimately, the question I always get asked, well, how many are you trying to deal with? It's in the realm of greater than 100 different instances of ERPs we're managing across Schneider. We have distribution centers who are running 5 ERPs within one DC. So you can imagine some of the data challenges that we're faced with just to try to drive a consistent visibility layer across our organization. Well,
and when you think about the big data analytics discussions that we've been having, where is the organization, and any insights to share about organizational readiness or building that brain to be able to do this work. Any insights there?
Well, I think there's a lot of excitement around this topic within our organization, and there are many areas where I think we're fairly mature in our processes, and many where we're still trying to grow and develop and have some struggles and growing pains that we're going through. I think our readiness and interest is very, very high, though. At one point you might have looked at an organization like Schneider Electric and said, well, they're an old industrial company, right? A company that was actually founded in 1836. And some of our products you wouldn't necessarily think of as a high-tech company, but I really think all supply chain organizations and all companies are really becoming high-tech companies. So, and I think that's the evolution of this digitization that we're facing. So if you don't think of yourself in that way, I think you're missing a huge opportunity. So.
Well, thanks, Kyle. Let's set the stage to talk about visibility, because I made the point that the companies that are working well are really challenging themselves in two areas. One is, what is visibility, and the second is, what is data, and how do I use data? So we're going to cover those two topics. And as we think about visibility, we've got to think about all data in the supply chain. And we have the growing long tail of the supply chain. And there's a belief that the supply chain needs to be tightly integrated and efficient. But when we have a long tail, we need to be very agile and responsive, because the tail does not have a very high level of demand predictability. I don't care what you do in demand forecasting, we are not going to improve the supply chain response of the long tail with the traditional approaches. In fact, the demand latency, the time that it takes from a purchase in the channel to the representation of an order has increased by about 10 to 15% in the last decade, depending upon who you are. And we're dealing with a supply chain that tends to have more volatility because of the increase in complexity. And of course, we've also grown the number of nodes in our network as we've become more global, and we have more outsourcing and manufacturing, more outsourcing to transportation. And so as a result, we have grown the Bullwhip Effect. And the Bullwhip Effect essentially says that at the point of purchase, sales are pretty flat, but as we translate demand across the network, the more nodes that we have, the greater the amplification and the distortion of the demand signal. So with the longer tail, we tend to have more amplification and distortion of demand. So the question is, in the building of networks and network visibility, can we use independent demand? So this is a consumer value chain where independent demand is really store-level demand. Is it possible in a network to allow a supplier to be able to see independent demand, or what is the shopper buying? And could we show the velocity and the flows across multiple tiers and multiple networks? And this is really not something that is on the docket for most companies today. In fact, today most companies will connect with suppliers through a signal out from ERP. So in the case of SAP, this is SAP S&C, and it will be a one-directional signal to suppliers. What's missing here is bi-directional communication, collaboration, and a system of record. So I talked to a supplier the other day for Caterpillar that says that the average order changes 5 to 6 times, and that it's very hard to keep this synchronized because they get so many signals that there's no system of record to know what Caterpillar really wants to have in their manufacturing line. So this one-way communication does not give us the level of visibility we need. In addition, EDI, which comes from a document, is a lot like getting a letter. You've got to open it, and there's some latency associated with it. And again, that's one directional. Now, in fairness to the traditional EDI vendors, they're using some big data analytics around how do I mine unstructured text and how do I use data pools to be able to change this. But for right now, let's just talk about the traditional EDI signals. Now, we see the evolution of business networks, which are canonical infrastructures, which allow us to have many-to-many flows. So that means that A transportation provider can communicate in one form, maybe it's XML, maybe it's EDI, maybe it's fax to EDI. A supplier can connect in RosettaNet, maybe another supplier could connect through another supply chain operating network. But the concept in a canonical is bidirectional flow based upon a many-to-many data model with each person that's responding to be able to communicate in the way that they need to communicate. Now, as this evolution of supply chain operating networks has evolved, the dependence on ERP as this visibility layer is going down. So this is from a recent study that we did where we asked about performance and confidence in the ERP provider to be able to do multi-tier visibility. And if you look at this, you can see that the belief is that ERP will help within the company or within manufacturing, but not within the extended supply chain. And that is our belief as well as we deal with big data infrastructure. Now, the concept we're working on in the network of networks is, could we have a network that has this many-to-many data model, it's simplistically here for trading partners, with a canonical infrastructure which allows people to communicate in the way that they want to communicate, with a rules-based ontology which allows us to have context to data and a many-to-many architecture layered with cognitive learning which would allow us to learn at the nodes, and a different way of visualization and perhaps benchmarking of data in the network. And we think this is important because the gaps in the current level of what people want and what they have are pretty high for either order management or first-tier suppliers or transportation network and third-party manufacturing. And so these are pretty high gaps. But when we look at what's happening, what people feel good about is phone, email, fax, and postal mail, right? They're sort of like Linus with his blanket wanting to hang on to spreadsheets and manual data. So one of our issues is people in the supply chain like to touch data, and so the ability to build new infrastructures to be able to work on multi-tier networks is something that's hard for people when they're in their Excel ghettos or they're dealing with phone, fax, and email with suppliers and they don't really understand the need. So Kyle, what's your perspective on this? I know you've been working with us on the network of networks work that we've been doing. Any thoughts here?
Well, I think what jumps out to me, right, is that confidence and strength that the supply chain professionals feel today around those phones and emails. And when you're reading articles that are thinking about and talking about autonomous networks and smart portals and AI type approaches to problem solving, you can see why there might be a gap or an intimidation factor there, right? So we kind of a way to go. We really need to kind of flip that bottom scale on that chart you have there, really talking about business networks and the end-to-end piece and the value network communication systems. So yeah, I think it really shows how much transformation that's really ahead of us still. So if I think about in the Schneider world, I sort of feel like I've spent most of my career kind of battling the bullwhip effect that you talked about. At first really with trying to deploy lean approaches and inventory management systems and late adaptation and types of activities like that, and now really trying to do it from analytical approaches around end-to-end network planning, end-to-end supply chain modeling, multi-echelon activities. So in Schneider, we are approaching the problem from that perspective, right? We've really begun and recognized that we really needed an end-to-end view, albeit somewhat tedious to get in place today, right? Again, many ERPs feeding into a system. We've gone to a third-party approach to be able to create that end-to-end view, but it's a starting point. We, like you, don't think that the ERP 2.0 is the answer of tomorrow. I think internally it's fine, but creating those value networks and understanding that canonical and how to communicate the one truth is important. In particular, you think about our organization where we have more than 45,000 suppliers. Those are primary tier 1 suppliers. So you can imagine the visibility to multiple layers down and then to our customers, very, very complex to try to manage and organize. So we need these analytical tools and systems put in place. We need these networks of sharing in a common practice to help us really be able to integrate and really drive that performance that we're looking for our customers.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. One question from Thomas is, what does PLM and APS stand for? So, sorry, Product Lifecycle Management is PLM, so those are the tools that help us with bringing new items to market. And APS stands for Advanced Planning, which is our demand and supply planning and our production planning tools that were really evolved in the 1990s when we were still arguing about 32-bit versus 64-bit architectures and the ability of data that we could stuff into memory. Now, we also had a question about, why are there so many ERPs? And Kyle, my perspective is that a lot of this ERP proliferation came from the kind of wave of mergers and acquisitions. I don't think people got up one morning and said they needed to create a new instance. I think that it's because so many companies have gone through mergers. Would you agree?
I really do think that's the case, right? Of course, I think there's probably some evolution and companies making migration to new technologies that can create some issues. But when you have organizations like ours that have such a huge variety of ERPs and number of systems that are in operation, I think it's largely through that acquisition piece. And it's just so time-consuming to make a migration. So the last thing you want to do is make an acquisition and then shut that operation down or have stumbling issues as you begin to try to integrate it into your ERP. So we've taken a very slow approach to that, which has yielded some benefits but also given us some complexity.
Yeah, and as we look at this evolution, with people having over 150 different systems, people want to evolve these horizontal processes, right? Even within the organization, if we're not dealing with multi-tier, and these horizontal processes are revenue management, really looking at bifurcated trade where we've got rebates and promotions and discounts to distributors. So we've got to deal with parties and really making sure we have performance-based contracts and that they're paid right. And so we have revenue management as a cross-functional process, sales and operations planning, new product launch, corporate social responsibility, and supplier development. And these are really our cross-functional processes that we're trying to bring together. But for a company like Schneider, which Schneider's not that unique, where you've got all of these ERP instances, you've got a global company, bringing this data together is complex, even to have cross-functional processes within the organization, much less to be able to deal with multi-tier. And even the understanding of the cross-functional processes is still pretty new because we're pretty functional. And so we do a lot of writing about cross-functional processes, and we find that often there's a need for compliance over cross-functional development. So this is some recent research we published today on supplier development, which supplier development is designed to help really strengthen supplier relationships and is looking long-term strategically. And we find 41% of companies today have a supplier development focus. Most companies are more buy, sell, and tactical, and the supplier base is pretty fragile. So one of the things that some of the analytics techniques that we're going to talk about is really around supplier sensing or design of the supply chain for the suppliers, or being able to move data so that suppliers can have visibility of independent demand and there's less waste. The other issue that we find in the building of these networks is the tie between networks and visibility and corporate social responsibility. So we find that 90% of companies have a corporate social responsibility document. 74% make some sustainability claims. So this could either be energy or fair labor or recycled materials, but something about the planet that's coming from the supply chain. But yet only 20% of companies really take their sustainability goals to their network. And we find that 65% of non-renewable resources, water, carbon, are in the network, not in the four walls of the company. So there's a risk factor, I think, that consumers may wake up and find that there's a situation that isn't ethical, or perhaps there is a sustainability issue in the network, or Perhaps, it would affect how the organization is treated in the sustainable, sharing of data on Wall Street with the special funds. So, Kyle, let's think about visibility as we think now about horizontal processes, not just the multi-tier network. Your perspective on Schneider, successes, struggles, achievements, any insights to share?
It's a key area of focus for us. If you think about trying to get leverage, you really need to kind of have those horizontal processes that are well defined and driving value across the organization. So if I think about in our supplier area, I'm proud to say we have a good supplier development program and diversity programs as well, but it takes a huge number of people to kind of manage those today due to the number of suppliers we're active with. The end of last year, we actually enacted a new project putting in place a data lake for just particularly some of our supply-based information and are able to do improved analytics. What was really pleasing about that is the technology today allowed us to go much, much faster than maybe what we would have done maybe just a few years ago in that same area. And the horsepower of computing today is so dramatically better, really. The limitation isn't on how many iterations you want to run. It's really more now on how clean the data and how you can infer from that data to really make good decisions. So, you talked about social responsibility. I think that's really important. I'd note that Schneider recently was recognized as one of the top 10 companies in the world around our commitment to sustainability and achieving objectives in that area. But I tell you what a huge challenge it is, and of course I think we've all probably seen things in the media of late around finding out where organizations learn that there's labor issues involved or a lack of control of a tier 2 or 3 or 4 supplier that's leading to an issue or misuse of products from a certain area. And when you're a large global organization, it's a huge risk to you. And we're beginning to think about things like in the future would blockchain and accountability and legal contract all the way through the products and processes, be part of our future supply chain organization. I think potentially so.
So, Kyle, we have a question from Lynn. He wants to know, how do you bring visibility and sustainability and best convince suppliers to share data? Any insights there? Because I know that Annette's really been working actively on supplier development and corporate social responsibility. Anything about supplier data and getting suppliers to share with you?
We have issues on kind of both ends of the spectrum. We have some small suppliers we work with, and sometimes just the reporting and the information we want is kind of a burden to them. And we have large organizations who sometimes don't want to share some of their information. But quite candidly, we're making it a term of engagement with us. So if you want to do business with us, this is important to us. We want to be able to drive this through. We want to be able to have improved visibility, be it from planning purposes to supply chain risk and traceability issues. So we're really kind of just driving it as a condition of being able to do business with Schneider in the future.
Well, let's now shift to analytics because we had, the discussion on visibility, and visibility and analytics I find are very closely coupled. Sometimes people say they want to improve visibility, and I say, what does visibility mean? And they'll say, well, aren't you the dumbest analyst in the world that you don't know what visibility means? But, visibility has all of those elements. It's got, the internal elements around horizontal processes. It's got the channel visibility. It's got first-tier suppliers, second-tier suppliers, transportation providers, contract manufacturers. And we've really got to think about visibility holistically. Now, as we move into global supply chains, which Schneider's a global supply chain, and Kyle's been very open, which I appreciate, talking about the size and scope of the Schneider Electric team, the original technologies were designed for regional supply chains. When I worked in the design of software, we did not really conceive of an organization the size of Kyle's to use the supply chain technologies. But as I work with new vendors that are coming into the space and I look at cognitive learning, I think we're 5 years away from supply chains that learn as we sleep. And we actually have about 7% of the manufacturers in North America that are working on cognitive learning. And some of the work that we have coming out of Europe on Industry 4.0 is also very focused on prescriptive and cognitive analytics. We also have, the work we talked about on the network of networks, which is bringing the analytics and bringing the connectivity to multi-tier processes. And the multi-tier processes will look very different than the processes that we have today that are single-tier. We have the evolution of sensing, which will redefine both service supply chains and digital manufacturing. So in sensing, we basically will let equipment talk to analytics through the Internet of Things. So instead of having predictive analytics schedules, we will have real-time data that will tell us when we need to take equipment down, and that will tie to supply chain planning applications, which will allow us to better run our factories and also our equipment for service. And I believe that we're very close to interactive UI, where a planner will come in the morning, and instead of typing and logging in and spending 4 hours on the computer looking at what happened last night, much like we talk to Siri on our iPhone, we'll come in and we'll say good morning, the computer will talk back to us, we'll say, how did we do last night, and the computer will tell us the exceptions. And not only tell us the exceptions, but the recommendations on the exceptions or the changes that the computer has made asking for confirmation. So the whole UI is changing so that we will have a descriptive, interactive UI. And this will lead to new business models. Just like we saw the evolution of e-commerce in the last decade, we're starting to see the evolution of, Amazon is now a software provider, and Amazon is now a consumer goods manufacturer, and Uber-like sharing and the collaborative economy will drive new models. And so one of the things around the use of analytics and the use of new forms of networks will be the supply chain organization's ability to really drive the concepts of new business to fuel the engine of growth. Now, at our conference every year, and we will be having our conference in September where we'll be talking about cognitive, prescriptive analytics, and Internet of Things, we'll be showcasing the research and also sharing the case studies. And we will be streaming this conference live across the world. And it's our hope that you will have the APIX chapter in South Africa and the SCMA chapter in Canada and perhaps, the Peru CSCMP around the world to chat with us about the evolution of technologies as we go along. But last year when we asked companies how they're going to proceed, they said they'll first start with advanced analytics, and then they're going to be looking at how analytics combine with the Internet of Things, how the confluence of the Internet of Things with 3D printing actually congeals, and robotics, and then move to social platforms. Now, in the evolution of the analytics that we're going to talk about, it's very different than what we have today in supply chain systems, in that today's supply chain systems are very focused on structured data. We want to put everything in rows and columns. The evolving technologies are around structured and unstructured data. And so when you think about unstructured data, we think about warranty data and quality data and social data and call center data and rating and review data. We have all of this unstructured data which is, surrounding the supply chain. And, we also have rules. So we have limited rules, single ifs to single thens. These are things like ATP or allocation or inventory matching to orders or rules-based consumption and forecasting. Those are very static in today's systems. And there's a single condition, a single if-then. But what we see in the evolution of rules-based ontologies is the ability to have adaptive rule sets and learning around these cognitive and rules-based ontologies, and a very powerful concept because that will allow us to have supply chains that learn through context of rules. And we put in optimization, linear optimization, which was pretty limited for a nonlinear system. And what we're going to have is the evolution of concurrent optimization, cognitive learning, combinatorial math, which will drive new discovery and new insights. So we'll be able to mine data out of data pools and answer the questions we don't know to ask today. So, when GM had ignition switch issues, they would have been able to see 6 weeks earlier that was an issue in social versus the mining of the call center data. And then, in the cloud, we have the ability to synchronize and orchestrate inter and intra-enterprise flows. So we no longer have to have the master data issues or the integration issues that we have today because of some of the use of these new forms of analytics. And we can focus on sensing, and we can also focus on deeper simulation. So when people think about the evolution of analytics, I challenge them to think about cloud-based architectures, which really allow us to go across applications or to grow across tiers, and streams, which streaming data architectures are very different than cloud-based architectures, which allow us to have data that moves at very high speeds. So we see a lot of the streaming data vendors adopting Apache Spark, which is an open source code to enable streaming data, and data lakes. So Kyle talked about a data lake where we would have structured and unstructured data that would be put into a data lake to allow some of the new forms of optimization for data mining. Now, in the data lake, we see the adoption of Hadoop. And Hadoop is a way that we can get structured and unstructured data together to be able to mine the data. Now, most companies, when they think about analytics, they're very focused on structured data, transactional data, and time phase data. The ERP architecture has really evolved for transactional data, and the advanced planning systems evolved for time phase data. But when we're talking about the evolution of these new forms of analytics, we're talking about combining structured and unstructured data along with sensor data and new types of data, so whether it's video or voice or mapping or digital images, to be able to drive data that has higher variability and different velocities. So not all data needs to fly first class, right? So we want to have right time data. And as we think about the analytics maturity, most of the analytics that we have today are descriptive. They allow people to see, and some people think about this as reporting or the UI of systems. And we're doing a lot of investment on things like Spark and Tableau and Spotfire. And these are descriptive analytics. And we have implemented predictive analytics for many years with the advanced planning tools or the manufacturing execution tools, where we embedded linear optimization from tools like iLog into those applications and the data models. But what we're starting to see now are prescriptive and cognitive analytics. And prescriptive analytics, most people are the most familiar with on Google Maps, where perhaps we're driving down the road and Google talks to us and says, you should take a different route because there's a problem ahead. So noted an exception, gave an alternative, and it's up to you if you want to accept it. And cognitive analytics allows us to learn. And so as we think about the analytics maturity along with non-relational data models with Hadoop, Hadoop evolved out of the e-commerce vendors where they wanted to really use massive parallel processing. And because the relational database vendors could not scale for eBay or Amazon, they started to develop a language and an open source code base for different levels of non-relational databases. And this allows structured and unstructured data. So, the names are not known by supply chain professionals. Many of them are foreign, things like Hive and Pig, but this is the new language of Hadoop. And most people haven't really thought about Hadoop and how to use Hadoop, but Hadoop is designed for dissimilar data. And I'm just going to give you an example of a use case of Hadoop that I think makes sense. If you're in Kyle's shoes where you have all these ERP systems, there's a push to do ERP standardization, and to me that's an opportunity cost for the organization because we focus on master data and tight integration, but Hadoop allows the data to stay at rest. And when the data is at rest, we can index the data for relationships. And the indexing of the data causes us to not to have to go through all of the upending of the data and the master data issues for the context. And so I think the movement of data across dissimilar systems is a wonderful case for Hadoop, and I also think the mining of unstructured data and structured data is a wonderful case study for Hadoop. Now, when I talk about non-relational and relational databases, and I talk about the evolution of analytics, this is an example of an ontology. And an ontology allows us to start with what we believe is a belief statement about the supply chain. And the belief statement lays out what we think are the rules for the supply chain. And so if you imagine that each of these lines is a rule and each of these little circles is a type of analytics, the yellow perhaps could be cognitive, the red could be prescriptive. This would be an example of a learning system that we're starting to evolve with a rules-based ontology on a non-relational database with learning, either prescriptive or cognitive, to be able to really work with this for learning. So Kyle, what have you learned about big data analytics, and how are you taking advantage of this opportunity?
Laura, probably to give the full answer there would take probably more time than we really have. If I were to maybe kind of hit a few high points, if I think about what has been the biggest transformation for me personally in this journey and thinking about big data, it would be, first off, the difficult transition it took me personally to make for a while to stop thinking about data in terms of very structured rows and columns. I'm an engineer at heart, right? So that's kind of has been my foundation I built off of. And to begin to think about data in that terms of indexed, unstructured, the availability to look for patterns across a variety of different things really kind of opens your mind to a lot of things, to the point where I think even my 2 teenage children are probably tired of hearing about my thoughts around big data and big data analytics and how important I think it will be in the next few years. So.
Yeah, any planned pilots or investments here, Kyle?
Yeah, I think we're at many different stages of activity. I mentioned the purchasing project, and we're moving very fast with it and getting some real benefit from it, and it's in full deployment. We have full deployments of analytics around network node optimization and end-to-end planning. But then there are pilots in some new areas, and I think those are exciting as well. Pilots in demand sensing, pilots in customer sentiment sensing, scraping the web for sentiment information and trying to improve the latency period there. So a lot of exciting things going on. Structurally, to kind of manage, we're making a lot of changes within Schneider as well. Again, I mentioned 180,000 employee, more than half of which are in the supply chain organization. A lot of people excited about these topics. So really the problem now is keeping people aligned around the common themes and approaches and practices we want to put in place so that we're not reworking areas across the organization. We've created some communities now within where we're electronically sharing ideas and projects so we can stay very close and aligned. We have, I think it's fair to say, a lot of interest and excitement around this. So, part of the opportunity, and I hear this in several discussions, is how are you funding your new data analytics activity? How are you funding some of these projects? And what I've really begun to kind of put in place is a realization that we have a whole army of people managing data today, either in the way we're trying to clean up data or manage master data or data governance. And there's a lot of opportunities to drive efficiency in this organization because of these activities. So I think there's some strong returns on these investments.
So we have a couple of questions. Thomas Lee is asking, can we provide a specific example of big data in the supply chain? And I gave the example of the use of Hadoop for leaving ERP data at rest for integration. We find that in supply chain, the issue is not data volume, it's data variety and data velocity. We also have streaming data with the Internet of Things. It's a big data problem. Or sentiment mining, which is looking at customer sentiment mining, which is a big data problem. A lot of people want to use social data. So this is an example of Lenovo that is mining social sentiment from Facebook or rating and review data and using it to listen. I think cross-functional listening will become the new cross-functional process. So while we've got these traditional cross-functional processes, I think cross-functional listening, which we see at Dell or Lenovo, will become a supply chain process. And I think sensing and adapting, whether it's supplier sensing or demand sensing, will become a new cross-functional process along with the network of networks. So Internet of Things is a data variety, streaming data, big data problem, sentiment analysis, the mining of social data, different ways of building multi-tier applications is a big data analytics opportunity, use of Hadoop and unstructured and structured data. We don't have necessarily the data volume because big data kind of connotates volume. Most people don't have more than a petabyte of data, but they're dealing with a lot of data variety, dirty data issues. And I also think the rules-based ontology and cognitive learning can be used to redefine master data. So we hard code all the master data in the organization, but what if we had a rules-based ontology and cognitive learning system that could learn about data? I think we could totally replace some of the master data concepts that we have today. So Kyle, I got a question. Are you building in-house expertise for the software, or what are you doing? Outsourcing it or building it in-house?
I think we do intend to have some internal competency. We don't intend to really develop software in-house, but we do want some data analysts. We really are migrating more towards a kind of a user practitioner type of model. I see another question there about what organizations or companies are offering these types of services today, and I would contend that all of them are. So Microsoft has Google Analytics is offering analytics, SAP has it, Salesforce.com has it. All of these big organizations and many, many, many startup companies out there are doing data analytics around the supply chain. So huge number of companies, obviously a key piece of the transformation I think we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years, a lot of activity in that area.
Yeah, and one of the problems that the vendors face is that they have a conundrum that everybody else is sitting on the sidelines waiting for other people to adopt analytics, right? So when we ask people if they're a first mover, which talking about Hadoop or talking about Apache Spark for streaming data or talking about sentiment mining of social data, people's first question is who else is doing it, right? And some of these concepts are very new for supply chain, and people are looking around going, you go first and then I'll jump, sort of like the penguins on the iceberg. How are you getting over this issue, Kyle?
Yeah, I think strong leadership within our organization and a strong realization that the companies that get here first and make these transformations and are able to drive efficiency in their organization, use more autonomous planning, are going to have a bigger impact in a shorter period of time. So it's just been an internal decision that we're going to push forward on this and move as fast as we can and try to be a leader within our industry.
So, I think Annette's leadership and, where Snyder's at is really a great model to emulate. So we're going to wrap up now. We think supply chains are 5 years away from learning as we sleep. I think we've got to stabilize legacy spending and rethink our IT strategies. I also think we've got to learn from the past to unlearn and then rethink supply chain processes, particularly around unstructured data and terms like efficiency and integration, and think about artificial intelligence, machine learning, cognitive learning, and think about rules-based ontologies, and to really rethink networks. I think the time has come for us to automate networks in new ways. So we will be continuing these discussions in our community called Beat Fusion. We welcome everybody around the world to join. It is our community to share the research and to have dialogue with teams. We'll also be showcasing a couple of case studies on cognitive learning, prescriptive analytics, and Internet of Things at our global conference, which is coming up on September 6th through the 9th, and it is in the Phoenician in Scottsdale, and I'm hoping that everyone can join us. And Allison, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Laura. So as a one just follow up, as a reminder, we will be sending out the slides and the recording link to everybody that attended today. So we do hope that you share this with other colleagues in your organization. And if you have questions, please do reach out to us. And again, as well, we encourage you to engage with us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter, join our LinkedIn company page, and follow us on SlideShare. If you have any more questions, please reach out to Laura and myself. If not, we did schedule our next 6 months worth of webinars. You can find that on our homepage, and you will be getting invitations to those as well. So we look forward to engaging with you, hopefully in person at our conference, as Laura mentioned, and if not, definitely on further webinars as we roll them out every month. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
And thanks, Kyle, for joining us. Bye now.
Thank you, Laura.